Today's lecture is a continuation of the lecture we started last week during the synchronous class, and so we'll be talking about the study of consumer behavior. Let's go.
So, there are some trends that are affecting consumer behavior in contemporary society. I don't think a lot of these are going to be all that shocking to you. Of course, one trend is the internet, right? So the internet has changed how we browse, how we buy, how we search or browse. I did say browse, sorry. Um, it's also increased omni-channel retailing, this idea of um, buying something online and then maybe going to go pick it up at the same store, returning it online, these kind of things. Um, this focus on health and beauty, we've seen a resurgence of um, health and beauty stores. So I'll give you an example. I would argue a decade ago, people knew what Sephora was, but it wasn't nearly as popular as it is now. People tend to be spending more money on things like makeup and skincare, shifting roles of sexes. Now that not only more women are in the workforce than ever before, we see more women in med school than men, which is a big deal. We see greater labor workforce participation among women. We're starting to see a bit of a decline among men. That has consequences. Now that women have more money and they have more buying power, that again has more consequences to how advertisements work, to who retailers are advertising to. It used to be that if you saw an advertisement for taking care of your kid while the kid was sick, or for vacuuming your house, or these quote unquote traditional female roles, the ad always basically focused on women. And now you see ads, and we'll talk about this later in the semester, where it's the dad who's taking care of the sick kid. It's the dad who's doing cooking and cleaning. Retailers have had to not only acknowledge the shift, but in some ways lead society when it comes to kind of seeing what this shift looks like. Um, we see greater diversity, not only in college classrooms, but when you go to stores, when you go to restaurants, we see more people from more income brackets being in a lot of places. It used to be that people who didn't have a lot of money, people who weren't quote unquote rich, didn't take these exotic vacations. I would argue, and I think most people would, most kind of retailers and marketers would argue that things like social media has prompted people to kind of want to go on more exotic trips, and kind of prompted people to want to um, spend more money or find ways to spend less. Um, we've seen a changing perspective on religion. It used to be that not only were people saying they were religious, people were practicing religion more. We see a rise of the quote unquote nuns, right? People, millennials and younger, and in some cases older, who are saying that they are not really religious. They may say that they're something like spiritual, that they're spiritual instead of religious. But what does that really mean? Well, we've seen a decline in people going to church. We've seen churches closing, and in fact, we've seen churches closing to build condos in those spaces. That has to impact how consumers feel about themselves, how they shop, what they do on Sunday mornings, so on and so forth. We've seen an increase in personalized economies. People tend to want a lot of personalization, and companies are having to grapple with the idea of providing that.
Speaking of trends, it is essential to understand demographic shifts within a population. In the United States, it's projected by 2060 that we will have a shift so that we have a larger group or a larger percentage of older consumers. You can see from the graph at the top hand corner, by the year 2060, it's estimated that about 24%, almost a quarter of the population will be made up of consumers who are 65 and older, versus 2015, where that percentage was only about 14%. You could see at the same time some of that that increase in population will come from groups such as those under 18. By the time we hit the year 2060, there's estimated to be significantly fewer youngsters, children in the United States. And we can see that now. I don't know if you've been reading the papers, but they say that fewer and fewer people are having children. And 2020, surprisingly enough, was a terrible year for childbirth or births in the United States. We can talk about all the reasons why, and then I think that's a separate conversation that you might want to have in a political science class or sociology class, something like this. But in this class, what we're going to focus on is, as marketers, how is it that we can cater to older adults, considering the fact that they're a larger percentage of the population. You're going to have to do different things to cater to these people. As people get older, they drive less. As people get older, they tend to maybe spend a little bit more time at home or spend more time resting. As people get older, their needs change. I know that, my aunt, as she has gotten, or she passed away last year, but before she passed away, she became less interested in things like music. She became much more interested in game show TV and TV. So stuff like that. We also know that the U.S. customer base is becoming more diverse, right? In terms of population. When we look at baby boomers tend to be about 75% white in the United States. On the other hand, when we look at millennials, only about 56% of millennials are white. We see huge demographic shifts when it comes to Latinos, who are about 9% of baby boomers, 21% of millennials. When we look at the black population, 10% of baby boomers, 14% of millennials. When we look at Asians, we see 9% of baby boomers are Asian. 6% of baby boomers are Asian, whereas 9% of millennials are Asian. These shifts mean that we as marketers and we as consumer behavior researchers know and understand that the shift means that there's going to be a broader set of needs and shopping habits. That there's diversification in terms of both age and in terms of race and ethnicity, is going to shift what becomes popular, what needs to be carried in grocery stores, or the types of foods that need to be carried in grocery stores. So, for example, we could say that we know a lot of grocery stores like Walmart might have what they call, which I think is kind of offensive, but what they call their ethnic section of the grocery store. That might actually need to increase. The size of that might need to increase to accommodate larger groups and larger percentages of Latinos, Asians, and blacks. At the same time, maybe, and I'm not trying to be offensive here, but this may be true, as older people shop more, it might be more beneficial to grocery stores to carry more ready-made food or easy-to-make food. I imagine that when you get 65, you don't want to be in the kitchen slaving away, even if you have 6 people living in the house to create a meal. You just might not have the energy to do that. And so again, marketers will need to figure out how to serve these groups based on these group sets of needs and their shopping habits. Let me geek out here as a marketer, and particularly as a person who studies consumer behavior, and say that one of the things that's so interesting about consumer behavior is that I can talk about consumer behavior broadly, but I could also have an entire semester that I teach about certain facets of consumer behavior. So, medical marketing would be fascinating to have a class on. Political marketing would be fascinating to have a class on. I actually think food marketing would be fascinating to have a class on. But let me get back to politics. And oh, let me also say that I think religious marketing would be fascinating to have a class on. Um, or to hold a class on. So, one thing that we see increasingly, not just the shift in the percentage of older consumers in society, and not just the shift in um, a more diverse group of millennials and Generation Z in terms of race and ethnicity. We also see this shift now in terms of what they call the nuns. And the nuns are people who are not religiously affiliated. We are, and when I say we, I mean in the United States, we have historically been known as a Christian nation because so many people in the United States identified as Christian. We see, however, this big drop in the percentage of people who identify as Christian. If you look at the chart on the right hand side of this um, PowerPoint, you see the number of men and women who say that they are Christian has decreased quite a bit. You see about a 12% drop in men and 11% drop in women. At the same time, people who say they are unaffiliated among women and men has increased by about 10 percentage points. And you see this drop in people saying that or groups saying that they're Christian. Across the board, right? And this increase in people who say that they are unaffiliated across the board. So when we look at millennials, we see a 16% drop in people who say that they're Christian. I apologize for laughing. I don't think this is a laughing matter at all. I laugh because the number is well, I laugh partially because I laugh at everything, but I also laugh because the number is so high. But anyway, this rise in what they call nuns, people who are religiously unaffiliated, will have a great effect on politics. Political ad spending is huge. Politicians spend a ton of money on ad spending and marketing. In 2022, I'm sorry, not 2022, 2020, I'm in 2022 and ready for it apparently. But in 2020, political ad spending reached $6 billion. So that's kind of why, politicians are out here chasing money all the time. They feel as though they have to a certain extent. But political ad spending reached $6 billion. That's actually more than spending on DTCA, which is direct to consumer advertising on things like medicine. So when you see like the Zymbalta commercials or the commercials for different drugs, I think that spending is about 3 billion, but political ad spending is about 6. The growth of nuns, people who are religiously unaffiliated, will have huge consequences and political implications. Nuns are very politically cohesive. They tend to vote heavily Democratic. 63% of them say that they are Democrats, or say they lean Democratic. Only 26% identify as Republicans or lean that way. If you are a Republican operative, if you are a Republican strategist, you are thinking about the future and how to make sure that your party is still in business, considering the fact that people are becoming less religiously affiliated, and this strong link between being a nun and not voting Republican. And so, these are issues that people in the Republican Party are really interested in. How do you get nuns to be interested in the Republican Party if they're growing at such a large rate? And what specifically about nuns make them so likely to vote Democratic, right? And if you're a Republican operative, what you need to be thinking is, what is it that we can do, or how do we worm our way into this so that nuns also see the Republican Party as a viable candidate for their votes. So something to think about again, if you're a Republican operative. And frankly, this is something to think about if you're a consumer behavior researcher, in the sense that if you study political marketing, you want to know what kind of marketing can we use to actually reach nuns, right? And if you're a Democratic strategist, I think you also need to be paying attention to this information, because you shouldn't assume that these people will always stay with you, or always vote Democratic. We've seen shifts where groups will vote a certain way and then change depending on what's going on. So, this is something that should be really considered. We also see this trend of focused on health and beauty. And a lot of that has been couched in this term of, or this kind of idea of self care, right? So, self care has meant that there are opportunities for marketers to market products and services that range from things like massages to vitamins to plastic surgery to hair implants, so on and so forth. People are much more likely to be interested in these type of things, right? Hair coloring, hair removal, makeup. These things are becoming more and more important, and not just to women. It's also becoming more and more important to men. In fact, the largest percentage increase in terms of self care and beauty products, men are actually leading the way. Now, to be fair, when we talk about kind of makeup, that usually is an umbrella term that will mean everything from body wash to chapstick. But again, the growth in that market right now is primarily coming from men, and we can see that, right? Dove has released a male line in terms of body washes and lotions and these kind of things. We see places like Sephora that are carving out space for male products, so on and so forth. And a lot of this is being driven by this idea of self care and, quote unquote, being good to yourself. I will say, though, that I read an article a couple of weeks ago, blew my mind, and it talked about how self care has become this mechanism for consumerism, right? So when we think about self-care, we think about spending money on lotions and face stuff and yada yada yada. And the article talked about this idea of self-care really being a mechanism for self-discipline. That self-care really means that you have the discipline to do things that you don't necessarily want to do but that make your life better. And that is self-care, much more so than buying yourself fancy lotions and soaps. I think that's an argument that people can have. I just thought it was fascinating. I thought it would be something that some of you, that might resonate with some of you.
So here's a think break question for you. Let's say you own a men's clothing store and your revenues have not increased in the last year despite a steady increase in foot traffic. People are coming to your store, they're just not spending more. You've tried offering sales, you've increased your advertising and your personal selling via store employees. What new ideas do you have? Emphasis on new. What new ideas might you have? Take a few minutes and think about that. So every time I pose the question on what would you do to increase sales, inevitably someone says, I'd have a restaurant, right? Like one of those situations where scantily clad women are walking around the store to convince shoppers to buy the food. I never understand that answer, right? I already said earlier that there's personal selling going on. I'm not sure that half-naked women will necessarily encourage a guy to buy a shirt, but maybe. I'm not a guy. I don't know. Open up the store. You should open that store and see how it works. What I will say that research has shown will work is doing something like painting everything red. And what do I mean by that? Actually putting sales tags on things and making sure that those sales tags are the color red. Why? Well, from an evolution standpoint, men love the color red. Puccinelli and all in 2013 have a journal of retailing showing that the effect of red versus black prices on perceptions of savings is influenced by gender. And specifically, male consumers perceive greater savings when prices are presented in red than when presented in black. Why is this the case? Why is it that a guy will walk into a store and say, "Oh, these people mean business. This sales tag is in red." And according to Puccinelli et al., this is absolutely not the case with women. Women do not pay attention to the color of the sales ad or the color of the sales sticker or anything like this. Why is it that men do? You tell me. Well, I would argue, and I am assuming you might as well, women might be more familiar with shopping. Research has shown women do more shopping than men, and so women may not be as quote unquote deceived by red pricing. Women may be thinking about pricing in terms of relative pricing. So they were in another store last week. They saw a similar shirt that was $45. When they walk in your store, if that same shirt is 44, they're not going to perceive a sale. On the other hand, for men who probably shop less, and I'm not saying every man does, but for men who do, um, then they might not know about the shirt from last week that was $45. They might see the $44 shirt in red and go, wow, what savings? Because as you know, a lot of retailers will say, used to be $90, now it's 44. So this is something that we know because of consumer behavior research.
So ultimately, the question is why? Why do we engage in marketing research? Um, well, I mentioned in the last slide, or at least the American Marketing Association did, that we need information, right? About customers, markets, competitors, partners, technologies, everything. Because that information feeds into our ability to craft marketing strategy and marketing tactics, right? And ultimately, what that information gives us is consumer insights. So we gain consumer insights, and those insights help us improve marketing decisions, right? The strategy and tactics that we decide to use, and ultimately, improving marketing decisions help us create value for our customers and to build relationships with our customers, right? Ultimately, that's what we're going after. And that's true, particularly of research that's done by companies, right? So, companies that engage in research really are looking for customer value and relationships. So before I get started with the examples that I want to use, I want to define theory because basic research often looks at theory and trying to advance theory. So theory is a set of assumptions, propositions, or accepted facts that attempt to provide plausible or rational explanations of cause and effect relationships among a group of observed phenomena. So, why is it that seeing someone else eating might necessarily make you hungry? Well, there could be some theories behind that. Um, so, a classic example of the distinction between theoretical and practical uses of a discipline looks at medicine, right? So, medical theory involves trying to understand the causes and nature of health and sickness, right? So, people who research medical theories are trying to identify, what is going on, why are different things occurring, so on and so forth. On the other hand, practical medicine is actually your doctor trying to help you be healthy, right? So there's a difference between the doctor who sees you in your waiting room and sees you in their office and the person who's holed up in a lab trying to figure out what's going on. One of my favorite um, quotes is by Kurt Lewin. Because there are some people who say that, we really don't need theory, we just need practice. But Kurt Lewin says there's nothing as practical as good theory, which makes sense in a lot of cases because if you don't understand what's going on, how do you fix problems? And how do you fix new problems, right? So maybe you don't need theory because you know exactly what's going on right now today. But what happens when the problem changes a little bit? If you don't understand the causal relationship between what's going on in the environment and what's causing that problem, then it'll be hard for you to figure out what happens when the problem shifts, if that makes sense. Another example of basic research is research that came out of Ohio State called sustainability liability. And this is kind of interesting. So the researcher was at the grocery, no, I think she was just like at a Walmart, if I remember her story correctly. And she's walking around, or some store like a Walmart, and she sees in the clearance section all of these pins that were made from sustainable product, right? And she noticed that, it was on clearance and she's like, why is this on clearance when most people say that they like sustainable goods, right? They like goods that are sustainable. What's going on? And so she thought, well, maybe there's a liability. Not everything is going to sell really well if it's sustainable. And what she found is that this is true. Essentially, her research shows that people like sustainable goods when they want the goods to be gentle, right? So, um, think about goods that you put or use for your baby or something that you might use on your person like face wash. You want those kind of things to be gentle. And so for those type of goods, you really like them to be sustainable. But she also found that for goods that you wanted to be strong, to have to really work hard like a pen or like your detergent, sustainability can be um, it can be a negative thing, right? So people don't necessarily want cleaning goods that are sustainable because they have this belief that they're not going to be as tough or as strong, which makes sense. Think about it. When you go to clean your kitchen, if you're cleaning your kitchen counters, a lot of people like to use goods that contain something like Lysol or bleach or a bleach alternative because they want their counters to be really clean and they want the product itself to be really strong, which is why a lot of times companies that come out with cleaning products that are sustainable have a little bit of trouble selling because a lot of people don't want sustainable goods when they think about their cleaning products. So this came about from basic research, but it has some really big ramifications for manufacturers and marketers. So again, laying the foundation for what goes on in the marketplace. Basic research here. So I said that I'm skeptical that companies will pay more. Why am I skeptical? Well, I'm skeptical because research shows that this is probably not true. And I'll kind of walk you through one bit of research. So there's this effect. We call it the fair trade effect, and this is kind of how it works. So researchers introduced coffee, fair trade coffee versus regular coffee to consumers. And what they found is when the price was the same, sales rose about 10% for the fair trade coffee, which suggests that there are consumers who are more attracted to fair trade. I will say one thing that's a little shocking from this just kind of very generic scenario on the left of the slide is that even though consumers say they're interested in sustainability, only 10% more of consumers were willing to buy coffee that's fair trade. You would think if, sustainability was really important, we'd see something more like 30-40% increase in sales for fair trade coffee. We didn't see that, which again, it makes me skeptical of the idea that consumers are really interested in sustainable products. But what's even more interesting, so if we look at the right of the slide, this was the second study that the researchers did, which is even more interesting. And so what they did was they took fair trade coffee right? And if you notice, both of these are fair trade labels. So one says fair trade, just regular coffee. One says fair trade premium coffee. And they put an 8% price increase for both products, right? So let's say the product was $10 before, now both products are $10.80. Um, and what they found is that for French roast coffee, regular, the one on the very right, that's fair trade, that had an 8% price increase, that product saw a 30% reduction in sales. So an 8% price increase for fair trade coffee led to a 30% sale decrease for the consumer or for the company. That's a big deal. Are you willing to pay for CSR? No, not only are you not willing to pay a little bit more for CSR, sales are going to plummet, right? Um, on the other hand, for premium products, when they had an 8% price increase, we didn't really see that much of an effect, right? So if the product is premium, consumers are more likely to go ahead and absorb the 8% price increase. But if it's not, and it's just sustainable, if it's fair trade, consumers don't want it, right? If it's generic, consumers are just going to switch to another brand, regardless of the fact that it's fair trade. Again, reasons to be skeptical about what consumers say is important to them.
So I talked about the idea that there are classifications for how we look at research. One classification is this basic versus applied. Another classification is qualitative versus quantitative research. So qualitative research gathers information that is not in numerical form. It might look at diary accounts, open-ended questionnaires, interviews, observations, so on and so forth. Qualitative data is usually descriptive, right? And it's harder to analyze because it depends on the person doing the analysis, right? So I'd like to believe that if I ran a study, actually this happens quite a bit. If I run a study, I have, co-authors, and we will all analyze the data, right? So each person, to make sure that we're all being as honest as possible, analyzes the data. We should all come back with the exact same results. On the other hand, with qualitative research, the researcher it's very subjective, so they get to kind of extrapolate from the data what they will. And if that's the case, then Bob might extrapolate Y from the data, whereas Sue might extrapolate Z from the data, right? So that's what I'll say. I'll also say we have, I'm going to talk a little bit more about qualitative research, but I will say up front, I do not engage in qualitative research. I'm not a qualitative researcher. So again, qualitative data is not characterized by numbers, but the data can be textual, it can be visual, it can be oral, right? It could be all of these things. Usually qualitative data focuses on stories, visual portrayals, meaningful characterizations, interpretations, and other descriptions. Um, it can create new ideas, right? So qualitative data can be used quite a bit to generate ideas for new products, for new advertising, new promotions, and for product improvements. There are some strengths to qualitative data. One, when you're looking at data from a qualitative standpoint, you can look at things holistically, right? Um, and you might be able to come up with a greater understanding of the problem or the situation than you would if you were using quantitative research. Remember, quantitative research tends to be quite rigid. And also, another strength of qualitative data is that it allows you to probe. So you're actually able to kind of interview people and to ask people to go deeper and deeper. Oh, why do you feel that way?
Well, how often has that happened to you? Well, why is this and this, so on and so forth. So I use examples, or I put examples of Burning Man up on these slides. So if you're a qualitative researcher, you might want to go, to something like a festival like Burning Man and ask people or talk to people, and ask them kind of, what made you come here? What do you gain out of being here? You might look at the pictures that people take while they're there. You could talk about all kinds of things, right? You wouldn't be able to do that so much from a quantitative standpoint. From a quantitative standpoint, you might just ask questions. Actually, you don't really talk to people as much, but you might have people, you know, you might document how much people are taking pictures. So are people there, just for pictures? Or you might document the number of people who go to these events, the amount of money they spend, so on and so forth. But those aren't things like, why are you here? What do you gain out of it? So on and so forth. I talked about the strength of qualitative research. There are some drawbacks. One, there are a lot of researchers who suggest that qualitative research lacks scientific rigor. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that qualitative research is very subjective. I mentioned before that analyzing the data depends on who's looking at the data, right? It's very subjective. It's very uh, open to researcher bias. There's a lack of generalizability with qualitative research. So, one of the things that we always want to do in quantitative research is say, hey, we found this phenomena here. We think that it might actually occur in larger groups as well, or with certain types of people as well, so on and so forth. You can't really do that with qualitative research. Oftentimes, qualitative research has small sample sizes. Of course it does. Like, you can't really go to Burning Man and interview every single person there or look at every single picture taken at Burning Man, right? So oftentimes qualitative researchers will choose a select few people, and kind of, or, you know, pictures or however they're doing it, and try to come up with insights that way. Some people say that there is a lack of transparency. I actually buy into this quite a bit because oftentimes, um, you have no real idea how the researcher got their data to begin with. They don't really describe that process. Whereas in quantitative research, at least the research that I do, you have to be very factual about where you got your data and how your data was collected. Um, so, a qualitative researcher could actually just be interviewing their friends. I'm not saying that's the case, but, it's a possibility, and because of the lack of transparency. Similar to the lack of generalizability, there is a lack of replicability, right? So it would probably be hard to replicate results with qualitative data because it depends on who you're interviewing, what the researcher believes to be true about these people, how they're extrapolating data from these people, so on and so forth. Um, so it's very hard to, replicate. Uh, some people say that the data is unreliable for that reason, so keep that in mind. And then last but not least, you cannot identify causal relationships. Now, I'm going to be honest and say that in a lot of quantitative heavy fields like marketing, causal relationships are the be all end all. They're always asking for quantitative relationships. So, keep that in mind when you're thinking about qualitative research.